All right, so today we are going to reinforce our watercolor skills, and we are going to do that through the use of turning a shape into a form. We're going to create a circle on our paper, and we're going to develop that and turn that into a form, which would be a sphere. So everybody has a compass. Absolutely no reason to adjust this center dial, no reason to move the pencil or the black needle point. All you have to do is worry about twisting it kind of left and right like this. And we are lining this arrow up on the needle point with 4. The only thing you should be worrying about with your compass is moving it kind of left and right like that and putting it at 4. Needle point goes in the center. Okay, I think the easiest way would just be to lay that down, hold it close to the needle point, grab your paper with your finger on the outside corners, and go all the way around. Do not press too hard. Remember, every single time we ever do a watercolor project, or painting for that matter in this class, we never want to see our pencil lines. So don't press too hard. Make sure you can still see it. Number 4. Okay, then grab your ruler and draw a line that will create our horizon line. A horizon line is where the sky meets the ground. You can still use the pencil from your compass, just kind of angle it in a point where you can do that. And now this is going to be the sky versus the ground, and then the ground will help us understand that this form is physically sitting on something and not just floating in space. All right, so now we have a circle. Once again, this is a shape, and we want to turn it into a form, which would then be a sphere. We'll eventually utilize these skills and develop our still life paintings. And today we're going to focus on understanding how to develop those highlights and shadows, and we are not going to use any white. The white of your paper is going to be the white of your objects, with that transparent idea that we did with our scales there, and then there is going to be no black used. We are going to focus on using complementary colors to develop a neutral. So I am going to show you what that looks like. All right, so we're going to use complementary colors to develop our neutrals. In this painting, absolutely no black was used. In this painting, no black was used. In this painting, no black was used. So a lot of professional watercolor painters. All right, so once again, talking about our complementary colors. When we start with watercolor, we always want to dip our brush in water to start. Water rehydrates the colors, so we'll always need that water. I'm going to come in with red. We never want to cross-contaminate our colors. So even though I'm going to mix this red with green to get a neutral, I need to put red in this new area. Take as much off as I can. Clean my brush off. Okay, dry it off with a paper towel a little bit. Now I can come in with my green. You never want to obstruct this green with another color, because like if I'm trying to make a blue-green and red's in it, then it's going to start to introduce a little bit of violetish color, and that would not be good. So we want to always maintain these as pure as possible. Okay, so now I'm going to mix my green with red, and you'll start to see that it develops a darker gray color. Okay, now it is a little bit on the green side, so that means I would need to add a little bit more red to even it out. So I'm coming in, cleaning my brush off, dry it off a little bit, grab some red, not too much, and then start to introduce that into that neutral gray, which was a little bit on the green side, and now we have our gray. Okay, now I'm going to do the exact same thing with blue and orange, and you'll see that you can obtain the same gray. So I'm going to come in with my orange, get a nice good amount on my brush, place that in the new area. We never want to cross-contaminate our colors. Cleaning my brush off, grabbing some blue, and introducing that into my orange. So there's two different types of colors. There are warm colors and there are cool colors. So right now we're a little bit on the warm side. Warm would be your yellow, orange, and red. Cool would be your green, blue, and violet. So right now this is a warm orange gray. So that means if it's warm, we need to reintroduce more of the cool color, and in this case the complementary color, which is blue. And then start to mix that together to even that out to get a neutral gray. And now we have another neutral gray, okay? And then finally we have yellow and violet. Yellow is a very non-dominant color, so that means I use basically 50% orange, 50% blue, basically 50% red, 50% green, but yellow is very weak, so therefore I will need to only use just a little bit of purple to counteract with that lot of bit of yellow. Okay, start to introduce that, mix those together. Maybe need a little bit more purple, clean my brush off because I don't want to contaminate. And create a neutral gray. Now we got a little bit too much on the purple side, which is perfectly fine. Come in and mix these together. And get neutral gray. Okay, so notice how this used to be red and green, this used to be blue and orange, this used to be yellow and violet, and now we all have very similar looking neutral grays. So once again, if you mixed all the colors in the color wheel, all these mixed together would be the same thing. So what you need to do is take your watercolor scales a little step further. So we dealt with transparent to opaque, which is how we are going to achieve the highlight on our sphere. Okay, this is just pure white of the paper, and then transitioning. So if I'm looking at my red here, this red would be right about here, this red would be here, and then further and further we go down to more opaque. You need to develop darks and you need to develop opaque colors to enhance the idea of three-dimensionality and form. Okay, so I will leave this guy right here so we can see it. I will go ahead and do an orange circle sphere. So currently circle turning into a sphere. I am going to start with a very transparent layer. Remember, with watercolors you can always go more opaque. You can never go more transparent. You can lift a little bit, which I'll show you, but it's always more smart to go transparent to opaque. You can't really go back the other way. Okay, so I'm starting a new area of orange, adding water to it, a lot of water at this point because I need it to be transparent. And I'm going to start painting my sphere. So you can go two ways about this. You can go wet on dry. So what that means is my paper is dry and my brush is wet. So I can start to paint it like that. Or you can go wet on wet. And what that means is your paper is wet. So we'll say my sphere is here. I know you can't see it, but I'm painting with just water, so it doesn't look like anything's there. And then this would be a wet on wet technique. So you can experiment with both. You can play around with them. So my paper is wet. You can kind of see that shimmering right there. So then when I introduce that, the paint immediately like bleeds into where that water is currently located. So this will be a wet on wet technique. The only thing I would say, just be a little cautious. Some students were doing this last class and they were overworking one spot, and then that starts to create little pills And those pills are the paper starting to like kind of rip and fall apart, and we don't want that. We want to keep the integrity of the paper. So you can see all those little speckly spots right here. Those are called pills when you're working with watercolor, and that means you're overworking one spot too much. So just be cautious of that. Either technique works. So we can go back to our wet on dry, and we need to make sure we're working quickly. With a sphere, there are no hard edges, so everything should smoothly blend into each other. If you let your watercolors dry for too long, they will create that kind of edge, but you can always come back if it's still kind of damp a little bit and reintroduce that and work in that spot a little bit to kind of blend it out. Now, when talking about a sphere, we are going to understand where our light source is coming from. So I'll just say the light source is still coming from the top right-hand corner of this. So there I am going to develop my orange into the light and slowly fade that out. Okay, so what I like to do also is a clean brush kind of technique or a dry brush technique. Sometimes we start to continue to work, and we're like, oh my gosh, there's still so much more paint on here, so much more water. So if you ever find yourself overworking too much water or paint, I like to come in with a basically dry brush. Just I dipped it in water, but cleaned it off. It's just a little damp, and then you can work what's already on the paper. So I can slowly start to blend. So this would be a dry brush idea, and just start to blend what's already on the paper. Absolutely no paint is on this brush from the palette. I'm just introducing it into what's already on the paper and blending that into what I need to blend it into. Okay, so then I can come back in, maybe grab some more orange, start to develop that opaqueness. Once again, we want to go transparent to opaque, but then soon enough we'll introduce the complementary color to get those neutral darks. When painting your objects, I like to paint in the shape of the object, so I'm kind of creating this like curling motion of a C or a parentheses almost. And when I would paint a flat object, I would paint it more flat left to right, like a cube. When dealing with light, you have to show that the object is curling away from the light source. So you need to introduce a little bit of color on the backside. A lot of students just put like this like white area right up against the edge, and that's not what it would look like true in life. So we need to kind of create this circular area. I'm slowly just blending what's already on the paper. There's no more paint on my brush anymore. I'm just slowly blending it into that highlighted source. And once again, we should have those progressional stepping stone ideas of going from one color to the next. And with, once again, this being a round object with no hard edges, everything should slowly blend into itself. Okay? So then when I introduce my darker value, notice that there's no neutral kind of colors close to my highlight. That's just the pure color of whatever you selected. So for this, it was just red. For this, it'll just be orange. And not only am I starting to go transparent to opaque, but I'm also starting to slowly introduce the complementary color into whatever color I selected. So we'll get a little bit more orange going. So in order to slowly introduce it, I have a lot of orange right here. I'm just going to grab a little bit. We don't need to make that neutral yet. We're going to start to introduce a little bit of blue into the orange. It's still majority orange, which I will show you a value scale of that. So now I'm starting to kind of introduce that neutral gray. Now it's kind of using that wet on wet technique. You can kind of see how it's blending into itself. I have blow dryers if you want to dry your painting off to really develop those layers. Make sure you're staying inside the lines, and also make sure you're painting right up against the lines. So notice how I've basically eliminated those pencil lines. This painting started exactly like this one, but if you paint right up against those lines, then you will eliminate the pencil by pushing it up to the edge. Okay, so now I'm going to come back in. See that I'm starting to overwork this too much with too much paint. So I can come in with my dry brush and start to blend it out. And this is going to take multiple layers to really develop that opaque value, as you see on that example there. So this might be a good point in time where I want to like blow dry it or just kind of let it sit for a minute so I don't overwork the paper and start to rip it. Okay. Also, when you develop your layers, this is fully dry. So whenever you paint something on top of something else, watercolor is transparent, and that's how it should be treated. So if I paint, I have blue here, and if I paint my orange on top of that, you'll still be able to see what's underneath. Okay, so you can still see that there is that blue underneath, and it's starting to create that neutral. So you can both develop those neutral or any color for that matter whenever you're painting down the road with watercolor or whatever you're doing. You can develop those colors both in the palette here, but you can also develop those colors both on the paper itself. So we are seeing how the mixture of those two colors that I just made develops that neutral right there. So that would be wet on dry, wet brush, dry paper. Now if I'm doing wet paper with, say, color, and wet brush, then you'll see how that just kind of, it bleeds into itself. Okay, so and it kind of creates like an edge. So the edge of the where the orange is, it won't really blend outside of that. It'll stop right up against where that puddle of water kind of is located. Okay, but we need to make sure we're not too much water. Like this would be way too much water. We can see it moving around, and then it might drip, and then you're like, oh no, I ruined my painting. So don't do that. Okay, so we'll let this dry for a bit. If you're at a point in time where you want this to dry more carefully, then go ahead and do that. And then understand your ground is going to be the complementary color working in kind of reverse. So your ground is strictly going to be just one color. So for this one, it'll be blue. For this one, it was the opposite of red, which is green. And you're going to do just that gradient idea on the ground. Okay, so opaque to transparent. So now you're working with opaque to transparent, but this time you're physically blending them together. This one you painted box by box in separation. For the ground on this, you'll paint progressively from opaque to transparent. Then for the shadow, you're once again mixing complementary colors. And in this case, I just mix my greens and reds together. When I was mixing my colors together, red is always the dominant color. So this would be a neutral orange. So we still see how it's still got an orange tint to it versus this was my blue orange. This would be a perfect 50-50 neutral. This one still has that warm aspect to it of oranges. So this is kind of what I would focus on the whole time here. Or you could go and make it a blue dominant neutral. So that's what you would do in the other one. So I'll just mix blue to this. So this is still kind of on the neutral side, but it's got more blue to it. And then that would be the shadow underneath here because my ground is blue. Whenever you think about shadows, shadows aren't just black. If you think about a tree, the tree casts a shadow onto the grass. The grass doesn't turn black grass. It just turns a darker variation of that green. If you think about me putting my hand on top of the table, like it creates a darker version of whatever that color is. Okay, so don't just be like, oh, shadow, black, boom. That's never the case. So make sure you don't do that. Also, if you are ready to move on to your ground, you want to make sure that your sphere is dry, because anytime you're using watercolor and it is like up against something that's wet, you run the risk of them accidentally touching, and therefore, so I'm going to intentionally mess up. If I accidentally touch my wet paper, remember that wet on wet idea versus wet on dry. If I accidentally touched my sphere with my ground, then it's instantly just going to gravitate towards where the liquid's at and bleed into it. Okay, so that would be a no-no. So I can maybe come in while it's still wet, come in with kind of like a dry brush, and we can try and lift and take it off. So what I mean by lifting, brush, pick up some of that paint, clean it off, pick up some of that paint, clean it off, pick up some of that paint, clean it off. And this is still in the transparent phase, so I can come back with my orange and layer that back on and kind of eliminate that mistake that I made. So whenever you're painting, make sure you paint. If you want to create a solid, crisp, clean edge, like this side is dry, you just need to make sure that you are, for those clean edges, painting wet up against dry, and therefore it won't bleed into it. Okay? And when I paint up against those edges, once again, it will eliminate the pencil line. The sky is going to be perfectly clean and white, so please make sure you're working on your craftsmanship so you don't get paint where it's not supposed to be. But aside from that, we are once again working transparent to opaque, but not only that, we're understanding how to mix complementary colors together to develop that neutral dark, because you need the opaque and you need the darkness, you need the lightness, and you need the transparent to develop three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional surface. All right, let me know if you have any questions along the way. I know that was quite a bit of information, but we already knew half of it from last class with our transparent to opaque. Now we're just starting to introduce those complementary color neutrals. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.